Today we are learning about adding and subtracting decimals, so let's add that to our table of contents on number 12. Unit 1, Lesson 12, Adding and Subtracting Decimals. We're going to be taking some Cornell notes, so take out a sheet of lined paper. I'm going to write the normal heading, your name, period, and today's date, October 6th. And then at the top of our paper, we're writing our objective for today. Students will be able to evaluate an expression with decimals by lining up place values. And our essential question for today is, how do you add and subtract decimals? So go ahead and fold up your paper to have two columns, one for notes and one for questions. Okay, so before we begin with adding and subtracting decimals, we're going to go ahead and review some things about decimals that will help us with today's lesson. So let's review. First thing we need to remember is that all numbers can be turned into a decimal. And an example of that is the number 2 can also be written as 2.00, because $2 is the same as $2.00. And the second thing is, we need to remember that each digit in a number has the name of a place value. So here are the names of place values. So let's say we have a decimal in the middle, and each digit before the decimal has a name, and each digit after the decimal also has a name. So the first digit is called the hundreds. This digit is called the tens place. And this digit is called the ones place. And then after the decimal, the first digit is called the tenths place, then the hundredths place, and the thousandths place. So that was just a little bit of review. So one question that we could write for our notes is, what are the names of the place values? So now let's move into our notes for today. Let's start with adding decimals. So there are a few steps when we're adding decimals. We're going to be adding positive and negative decimals today, so you're going to be using your foldable to help you out. So let's start with example 1. Let's try and solve negative 14.5 plus 2. So I'm also going to add a third column here as our justification. So the first thing we need to do is we need to find the decimals in both numbers. Since the number 2 does not have a decimal, we know from our review that every number can be turned into a decimal. So we're going to rewrite this problem as negative 14.5 plus 2.00. And we're going to have a decimal in both numbers. So the first step is to locate the decimal, and we can add one if necessary. So now we have two numbers with decimals, and we are looking at one negative number plus a positive number. If we look in our foldable, when we're adding integers, if they have different signs, we're going to subtract the numbers and use the sign of the larger absolute value. So we know negative 14.5 is further away from 0, so that's the larger absolute value. So we know that our answer is going to be something negative. So at the end, our answer is going to be something negative, and I'm leaving some space for our work. So I'm going to determine the sign of the answer. And I know it's negative because negative 14.5 is further away from 0. And my rule also tells me that if they are different signs, I'm going to subtract. So I'm going to take 14.5, and I need to line up the place values. So this is the tenths, ones, and tenths. And then this is the ones, tenths, and hundreds. So I'm going to line up. I see both of them have tenths place. So I'm going to line up the tenths place. My decimals should also line up. And then my 2 is in the ones place. And I can add zeros at the end. So I'm subtracting because they are different signs. And I'm going to subtract 0 minus 0 is 0, 5 minus 0 is 0. I'm going to bring my decimal down in the exact same place. And I keep on subtracting. And I get 12.50. I know my answer is going to be negative because this is further away from 0. So my final answer is negative 12 and 50 hundredths. So my third step was to add or subtract, and that depends on the signs, and I know I subtract because they had different signs. So it says subtract the numbers. And then I get my final answer, negative 12.5. Let's try another example. Example 2. Let's try negative 6 plus negative 8.24. You're going to follow these 3 steps and use your foldable to help you determine the sum of these 2 numbers. Please pause the video for the students to try this independently. Hopefully you were able to finish this problem. Let's check to see if you got the right answer. So the first step was to locate the decimal, and we need to add one if necessary. So here we need to add a decimal because we don't see one, so I'm going to rewrite it as negative 6.00 plus negative 8.24. Then I'm going to use my foldable to determine the sign of the answer. So I see a negative 6 and a negative 8.24. So in adding integers, I'm going to find the rule for adding integers with the same sign. If they have the same sign, I'm going to add the numbers and keep the sign. Add the numbers and keep the sign. So I'm going to add these 2 and I'm going to keep the same sign. So I know my answer is going to be something negative again. And now I can line up my place values. So I have ones place, decimal, tenths, and hundredths. And then in my second number, I have the ones digit is an 8, and then my tenths and my hundredths all lined up. And my rule tells me, my foldable tells me to add them up because they're the same sign. So I have 0 plus 4 is 4, 0 plus 2 is 2, my decimal is still there, and 6 plus 8 is 14. And I know my answer is negative, so it's going to be negative 14 and 24 hundredths. Check your paper to see if you have these steps. We're going to write the justification. And if you got something wrong, please fix it on your paper. So first, we locate the decimal. Second, we determine the sign of the answer. And we do this using our foldable. And finally, we add or subtract, depending on what the foldable tells us to do. So our question here would be, how do we add decimals? So that was adding. Let's move on to subtracting on the back. Let's try subtracting decimals. So we're still sticking with positive and negative numbers. This is the same idea, but now we are using subtraction problems. So let's see example 1. Let's try a negative 35 minus a negative 13.86. So again, we need a justification column. So when we were doing subtracting integers, subtraction was difficult, so we wanted to change it to addition. So the first thing we do is we change to an addition problem. And the way that we do that is we take the sign, we change the sign to addition, and that means we have to change the second number to the opposite. So if I rewrite the problem, I get negative 35 plus, this becomes a positive 13.86 because that's the opposite of negative 13.86. So now I have an addition problem. I do exactly the same thing as we just did with adding decimals. So then I need to locate my decimals and add one if I need to. So I see negative 35. I don't see a decimal, so I need to add one. Negative 35.00. And everything else stays the same. Then the third step, I'm going to determine the sign of the answer using my foldable. So I see adding, so I'm going to look in my foldable under adding, and I see a negative 35 and a positive 13.86, so I know I am going to look at the different signs. So if it's different signs, I have to subtract the numbers and use the sign of the number with a larger absolute value. Larger absolute value means further away from 0. So I'm going to find the one that's further away from 0. I know negative 35 is further away from 0, so my answer is going to be something negative. And then it tells me to subtract the numbers, so I'm going to line up my place values and subtract. So I have 35.00 minus 13.86. And in this case, I cannot subtract 0 minus 6, so I need to borrow from the ones place. So this becomes 4, but I still need to borrow one more time. So 10 minus 6 is 4, 9 minus 8 is 1. I line up my decimal and keep subtracting. And I know my answer is negative, so it's negative 21 and 14 hundredths. So finally, my last step was to add or subtract, depending on what the foldable says. Since they're different signs, I'm going to subtract. Here is an example for you to try independently. Let's try positive 61.50 minus a positive 45. Please pause the video here so students can try this independently. Hopefully you've had enough time to write your answer. Let's check to see if you got it right. So the first step is to change to addition. Addition makes the problem a little bit easier, so we're going to change the sign, change the operation, and find the opposite of the second number. This second number is a positive 45. So we have 61.5 plus a negative 45. Then our second step is to locate the decimals. So we have a decimal here, and our second number we need to add a decimal at the end. So it's 61.50 plus a negative 45.00. Then we need to determine the sign of the answer using our foldable. So I'm looking at adding integers, and I have a positive 61 and a negative 45, so I'm looking at different signs. So I'm going to subtract the numbers and use the sign of the number with a larger absolute value. We have to see which one is further away from 0. That's the larger absolute value. We know 61.5 is further away, so our answer is going to end up being something positive this time. So now we line up our place values. We have 61.5 and 45.00. And it told us to subtract. So I can just subtract, bring my decimal down, and I end up with 16.50. And that's positive, so it's positive 16.50 as my answer. And in this case, the foldable told us to subtract. So check to see if you got the right answer. If you did not, please erase it and fix it. So that was subtracting decimals. And we're going to write a question. How do you subtract decimals? So now I'm going to give you some problems for independent practice, and if you don't finish these problems, they are for homework. Please do that, write them on your notes and do them on a separate sheet of paper. So this is the independent practice. And whatever you don't finish is homework. And these problems should be done on separate paper. Number 1, write this down on your notes. Negative 2.6 plus negative 4.51. Number 2, 4.5 plus negative 7.5. Number 3, negative 2.55 plus 6. And now we'll try some subtraction. 5.5 minus 7.25. Negative 6.5 minus 2. And the last one, negative 2.25 minus a negative 5. So write these on a separate sheet of paper. This is your practice, and whatever you have left is your homework. And remember, write it on a separate sheet of paper.